Welcome to another edition of Backstory. Today we're chatting to the author of A Lonely Girl is a Dangerous Thing by Jessie Tu. Thanks, Jessie, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. So I think we'll just dive right in. I'd like to talk a little bit to begin with about how the book came to be. It's your first novel, but you're not a stranger to writing. You're a poet and you've been writing journalism, non-fiction for a little while. So why a novel and why now and why this topic?
I think I found myself in a place where I needed to extrapolate a lot of the questions I had around a lot of the personal struggles I've had with relationships I've had with men all through my 20s. And there was this one particular relationship towards the end of my 20s that was very harmful, and it was harmful in a way that I didn't understand. And I wrote it actually while I was in this relationship because I was trying to work out why I was still in it, even though on the outside, I could see myself being a victim of something that I had seen from a lot of different places, you know, on TV, in the media. It's so easy to see another person's story and to really recognize who is being harmed and who is being the harmer. But when you're inside your own insular space and you're sort of entrenched in this very severely emotional relationship, you don't recognize it yourself and you don't have the language for it. And so despite the fact that I had predominantly written nonfiction and poetry for my entire life, I felt that I could only understand and also have compassion for myself because I had a lot of shame as well that I was carrying about being in this relationship. And the only way I could try and approach that kind of feeling of shame was to narrativize it through someone on the page and fictionalize a character who was similar and yet different. So obviously I'm not Jenna. I was never a prodigy, you know, but she struggles with a lot of the things that I struggled with. So that's how it started.
Yeah. And so I guess looking at the similarities and the differences between you and Jenna, you make the character Taiwanese immigrant like yourself. Like you said, an interest in violin, but obviously she's had the world fame attached to it. Where do the similarities stop, and what was done really specifically to make sure there was a distinction?
I think the biggest distinction is the fact that she is a phenomenal musician, whereas I wasn't.
Yeah.
I was actually quite mediocre, but like if a layman heard me, they would have thought I was quite good because, you know, the metrics for the layman is so different to someone who's actually within the classical music world. So I made that very intentional, that she wasn't just this kind of mediocre classical violinist, but that she had a very, very intense upbringing. It was very specific. She was gifted with this skill, this prodigiousness. And so that was very much outside of my own experience. And she has a lot of friends as well. Like I did not have as many friends as Jenna when I was her age. Like I was this awkward, like I only moved out of home after university because I grew up in a very severely traditional family who, like, my parents didn't really want me to move out until like I got married, but I just could never do that. So like her sense of independence and also her agency and her circle of friends, all of that social clout she had, it's totally not what I had.
Yeah. Speaking of friendship, actually, that brings me to a point that I was going to ask you about, that Olivia and Val are two of the main friendships that she has, very different female characters, and complex relationship that Jenna has with both of them. And I think that the thought processes that she has when she evaluates the friendships was really insightful, and a lot of people would be able to relate to the things she grapples with. And I wondered if that came from observations of relationships around you or female relationships that you had witnessed, or whether it was from personal experience of relationships that had that same dynamic.
Yeah, definitely a bit of both, I'd say. I've always felt that in literature, at least what I had grown up reading, there's this real deep sense of like a poverty of the sort of apparatus we have in our minds thinking about female friendships specifically. And it's always been kind of toxic. Like the stories that I grew up reading and watching on film was always just like two girls vying for the same guy, or it was always romantically related. And I was so just uninterested in that kind of competition. It was so alienating to me. And I felt also that the struggles I've had with my female friends haven't been centered on men specifically, but on just on our own sense of trying to create our own agency. And within the art world, it's so small in Australia that there is this sense of, at least in your early 20s, I know that there was always this sense of competitiveness amongst your friends, you know?
Yeah. And speaking of that competitiveness, you really do shine a light on sort of the elite nature of the classical music world, and also the art scene, particularly in Sydney, but in Australia more generally. And it could be read as a little bit of a criticism of how insular they are, and how sort of the gender roles and the racial roles that are sort of perpetuated within those communities, if you like. That was obviously quite deliberate, a deliberate statement on what you were seeing.
I think so, yeah.
And is it because you've had experience of those, or because you haven't been able to have an experience of those because of how insular they are?
I think I was quite blunt in my criticism of that whole space, because I was baffled as to why people didn't talk about it more and call it out. And I wanted to call it out. Yeah.
That's great. If we can shift for a little moment and talk about one aspect of the book that I think raises a really important point that isn't discussed widely and frequently, particularly in literature, and that is a woman's use of pornography. In Jenna's case, it's her insecurities and her loneliness that drive her to watch porn, but in particular violent porn. And I'm just quoting from the book. She says at one point, "I need these images, moving body parts on the screen. It has to be violent. It has to be quick. I can't separate a girl suffering from her pleasure. I've always reached for violence. The more violent, the better. The man needs to be older. He needs to be in control." Can you unpack that a little bit for us, for those particularly that haven't read it, and just that idea that women might seek out pornography as a way of, not feeling alone and vulnerable?
The whole issue of pornography is so controversial, and it's so complex. And, we've had second, third wave, fourth wave feminists say really interesting things about this whole space. Everything that I'm saying right now is still a continuing working hypothesis. So I feel like my thoughts about this will always keep changing. But what I wanted to do, I think, with the character of Jenna and the sort of the way in which she reaches for such violent images is perhaps making a statement, or like just reflecting on the strange observations I would see, and very uncomfortable observations I would see, in the ways in which pornography is sort of like the modern day education that young people have about what sex involves and how performative it is. And the performance of sexuality is almost like the most important thing for a young person. It's the ways in which we as a society sort of adjudicate a person's worth, at least for a young woman. I think that her sexuality is adjudicated in a way that's not for a young man. And our merits for that are it's so contrasting and different, between the two genders. And what I had the problem with, I think, is just the violence of it, and how when you see something on the screen and you see that you're supposed to behave that way, you end up as a young woman feeling like that is the way to project yourself. And you kind of diminish your own sense of, is this actually feeling right for myself? Like you don't question it because you've seen it so prevalently sort of heralded as this thing that is a marker for your value as a young woman, that it can tend to just blur the lines of pleasure and pain. And I think it's something that a lot of young women, I mean, young women grow up to be adult women. And then, you know, there's so many adult women now, and amongst my friends in our 30s, who still are kind of struggling with coming to terms with what pleasure and pain and sex and all that, and the idea of mutuality thrown out the window. All those things are so complex, and they're still struggling over what, you know, good sex looks like. I think that's really sad, and I wanted to start a conversation around that.
Yeah, it's really important for young people to sort of realize they're not alone in trying to work out, you know, who they are and where they fit in, and that sex plays a part in that as a young female. And I think the idea that heterosexual females as well do still have some identity crises. I think, you know, where there's a lot of focus on the fact that LGBTQI community obviously have a lot of struggles, but I think just generally self-identity within your 20s is a problem, and sex does play a part for a lot of people, and it's really refreshing to read something that really delves into that and looks at how you do come to understand who you are. So it was really great to read that. And I think the thing that really caught me about it was that I would hope that a lot of new readers would come to this and think, oh, wow, I can see myself in this. And I wanted to ask you about whether when you were growing up and what you've been reading, you could see yourself in what you were reading. Because I think that's a really interesting thing now that, you know, we talk about own voices, and we talk about you can't be what you can't see, and people relating to the characters in art around them. And obviously, you know, we probably all at school read Dead White Men, and now that's sort of shifting a little bit. So yeah, I'm interested to hear your take on if readers will relate to Jenna.
I've been so crushed by this overwhelming sense of gratitude by the response I've had from young white women, who have come to say, oh, this story was written for me, that they see themselves in the character I've created, which is just so extraordinary for me, because when I sit down to write, I don't think about audience at all. I think about what do I need to make sense of the messiness in my heart and in my head. And so when someone outside of my existence, my being, relates to something that I've written on the page, it's always extremely, extremely the opposite of loneliness. You know, it's so sort of life affirming to hear that. And I think it's absolutely critical. I think the idea that we all need to see our own experiences, specifically a very minor and very small details and parts of our lives, reflected on the page. And because if you don't see yourself on the page, you literally feel like you don't exist. Like your views don't matter. What you go through, the society is telling you it does not matter. There's no merit or worth to, or no sense of universality to what you're going through. And so any story that speaks against that is so important, and any story that helps someone feel less alone is so important.
And that invisibility that you mentioned, it leads to loneliness, doesn't it? Because you just feel like you're the only one going through these issues, or the only one feeling a particular way. So I guess in a way, a lonely girl is a dangerous thing might add to less people feeling lonely, which is quite lovely.
Yeah, I hope so. That's definitely what the kind of world that I want to live in, is where I think the kind of world I want to live in is where people don't feel any shame in talking about whatever they want to talk about. And I feel like even though it's actually much worse in Asian countries, still in Australia at least, talking about sex openly is seen as unsavory, or a bit like it's like a private area in our lives. But I don't feel like there's any, like, I understand why people wouldn't want to talk about their sex lives openly, but I think if people did, we would feel less lonely and less like jealousy, because we always think that other people are having more sex than we are. But it's like I think I have this strong, deep belief, and I've always had it, that if we were more open about all the things that trouble us and all the things that shame us inside our hearts, I think this will be such a more inclusive and like less depressing world.
That idea of shame, and you also touched on the idea of that it's a little bit different in Asian families. I did want to ask you about a couple of things to do with the fact that Jenna's Asian, and one of them was that it's, and this may be a personal reading reflection coming through, but I have found that stereotypically in literature, Asian mothers are quite demure, and fathers are the ones that are really driving their children to succeed and do well, and are the strong character that comes through. And so it's really interesting to have kind of a reversal of that in this book, where Jenna's father really takes a back seat, and it's Jenna's mother that is the one that has a very complex relationship with her daughter. And I wondered whether that was a decision you made early on, or whether it's just the way it evolved, or whether it was reflective of something in particular.
I love that. I actually, because like I rarely ever read any, at least like if we're just speaking here specifically about literature, I never read any stories that revolved around Asian families. So the trope that you mentioned about the dominant father, I was definitely not trying to play against that. I think I focused on the mother because I think, just in hindsight, thinking about it now, it's because I wanted to work through a lot of messy feelings I had about my relationship with my mother. And we were so different, and I didn't ever understand why we were so different, and I wanted to work through that messiness and confusion, because my mother she grew up in a different generation, a different culture, where her ideas about love and what it means to love and how to love are so vastly different and almost opposite to the ways in which I learned in Australia all those questions. And that kind of and I've always been interested in mother-daughter relationships. It's so I feel like it's under described, at least with like migrant families. So I wanted to write about that.
And it's great that you have, and I do think that's another area that the readers will really relate to, because I don't think it's just in your family or in an Asian family where there are things. I'm from a European background, and I think that Western European ideals about what a woman should be and what a mother should be and what a daughter should be, there's so many rules around it all, and I think readers will really relate to the complexity of the relationship of being a daughter and being a mother. It's really it makes you think and question, which is fantastic. We might move on to a couple of specific points I had about the language used, and I wanted to ask about this idea that some of the men in the story are only labelled, I suppose, or given names that are where they fit into Jenna's life. So it may be that they're where they fit in orchestra, where they fit in a band, where they fit in her life, but not necessarily given any more credence than that, other than just it's tuba, it's bassoon, it's bass player. Was that a really deliberate thing to show the relationship status, I suppose, and the idea that there was a real inequality in what was going on?
Definitely, that was intentional. I think I was just playing around with the idea of the politics of revenge, because I have been frustrated by the ways in which men have historically in the literary canon objectified women, and I think I wanted to flip that around and portray a character an Asian woman who flipped that power dynamic and sort of like say, hey, I can treat men like trash as well, and I can objectify them, and I can casualize sex and not treat you like a human being. But what ends up happening is she just feels even less lonely and empty, because that never works. Whenever you objectify any human being, or you don't treat them like a human, i.e. call them by their names, it says something about you, not about what you're trying to do. It just says that you are the one who is afraid of intimacy or treating someone on the same level as you, because Jenna uses sex to feel more powerful, and we see the destructive consequences of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And speaking of Jenna feeling more powerful, I'm just flicking through my questions to find the right one. Just this idea that she does have to keep changing, depending on who she's with, and this idea that she can never really truly be herself. And there's a line where you say, she says, I keep morphing into different women with various faces and shapes. I can't stop shifting. I switch roles and amend behaviours to suit the people around me. Isn't that what being an adult is all about? And I think that so many people reading it would go, oh, yes, absolutely. I'm never really who I want to be or who I really feel I am. And just that idea that, it's either a power play or a gender role, whatever it is, there's always more going on than meets the eye, and you can't ever just truly, like you said, talk about sex if you want to, or, disagree with your parent. You've always got a different face on.
Yeah, I feel like we always, and this is not even a racialized thing. I think it's universal. Yeah, like Absolutely. You say so beautifully. It's this exhaustion of always living a life where you have a sort of veneer layer, and there's always this sense that you need to perform niceties. And like a few minutes ago when you mentioned, the roles that women play, the daughter, the mother, the wife, like we fall into those traps because we still continue to reward women for taking on those roles so well. Very and any true. Woman who steps outside of those barriers are still sort of ostracized or othered. And so it's so hard for us to not play those roles, or to at least do what we really want in our own hearts, because you just get banished. And our need as humans to belong is almost so much greater than, always, I think it's just as important as, food, shelter, sex. And I'm so devastated by that hunger that we have to feel like we belong, that we actually let go of our need to shine our own light. And that we would be happy to, like, I think so many people, this is awful. This is like a sort of horrifying reality that I honestly believe that, because I've met so many people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and they tell me, I have most of my friends are very, very multi-generational, and the older people sometimes tell me that they look back on their lives and realize that they have hardly ever asked themselves or pursued what they really wanted to do. Because it was just so much easier and more accepting to do what makes other people feel comfortable, or like to perform what is the standard. And I think that's heartbreaking.
Absolutely. And I think that's why when Jenna really does fight against those constraints and do things that she feels she needs to do rather than just what's wanted of her, it takes such courage. So she's really quite a courageous, even though she's so lonely and she's so vulnerable and she feels like she's messing things up, she really is quite courageous to follow her heart at times and do things against what other people wish her to do.
Yeah.
And that's it's really great to be able to read about a courageous woman and sort of think, oh yeah, there are women out there that do rise above it all, I suppose. Changing tack completely. Jenna's soft toy companion monkey. He's so much more than just a symbol of the lost childhood. Can you tell us about why the need for a childhood object that sort of moves with her into adulthood?
I think I was trying to make a comment about how when we're young, we have these ideals about, and really pure fantasies about what kind of person we would like to be and how we would like to change the world. When we're young, we are not aware of the realities and the barriers of the real world, so to speak. Yeah. And there's a sort of purity and beauty to that sort of childhood dream or like state of mind that is inevitably lost when one grows up. And because Jenna didn't really have a normal childhood, she was basically like thrust into adulthood once she became a performing artist. She was always just surrounded by adults. That I wanted to sort of show how there's a tragedy about the ways in which we inevitably have to give up our former selves. Because I feel like when I meet a person for the first time, I often like to talk to them and ask them about what kind of child they were, or what kind of kid, like what kind of girl or boy they were, because that often is so indicative of who they are at their core. And I think in a way, men tend to have to give up their ideas of who they wanted to be in a way that is very different to a young woman, because men are like gender constraints and gender constructions. You know, the idea of gender for me is like a system of violence. And I think men, young men at least, when they have this sort of like very clear-cut rite of passage where they're boys and then they're men, and men cannot show emotions, they can't cry, all those sort of instructions they have, I find really, really, really upsetting. And like, it's a psychic mutilation when you become a man, because you can't behave, like you can't cry, you can't be emotional. Whereas like for us girls, I feel like I can still talk to my girlfriends about my feelings and emotions. And men don't have that. I think a lot of straight men don't have that capacity or that freedom where they can go to another friend, a male friend, and talk to them about feelings and emotions. And that's really sad, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not really examined that much in the book, but the idea that that men, if they're really good at something, that's enough. Sorry, I said it wasn't really explored, but in actual fact, when they're competing for the different roles within the orchestras and stuff, it's actually very, very examined. This idea that women have to be more than just good at something to get the position or move forwards, whereas for men, because they're men, it's, oh, you're good at something, well, let's push you to be the very best you can be, whereas women have to also be all these other roles that we talked about, and adhere to all the other stereotypes that you know, that men just don't have to jump through the hoops. And that was really quite evident within the book, but obviously it's such a commentary on what's going on within the world.
Yeah, we have to be nice and likable.
Yes. And Jenna really struggles with that at times, doesn't she?
Yeah, I hate the idea. I think I've tended to find that the people that I'm drawn to have always been people who are not eager to be liked, because the people who are so eager to be liked, I think to me, it speaks of a sense of insecurity.
Yes.
When you need someone to like you, or like you need the world to like you, it means that you're not comfortable in your own skin. And I actually have always been drawn to people who just like don't give a shit about what others think of them, and just they're in their own selves, and they're okay with that, and they're comfortable with that. But like, you know, like you and I said before, it's so hard to be that way.
Absolutely. And I think social media is going to play a bit of a, well, is already playing a massive role in that. You know, you've got this whole instant gratification, and yes, people like me, and yes, I'm doing what I should, and then the ones that are just like, nah, I'm just going to do what I want to do and speak my voice, and if people like it, so be it, but I really don't care, you know. Sort of up yours if you don't. So
exactly.
It's certainly a change in time that I think is well reflected in the book. And actually, I wanted to just briefly touch on the point that Jenna is quite obsessed with her phone and being in constant contact with people, and only because obviously she's lonely and she wants that comfort of knowing that people are thinking of her and people are wanting her and that sort of thing. But she's, you know, really, and obviously it's the way that people communicate with her for her work and things as well, but she's constantly checking her phone, and she's constantly looking at her emails, and even her girlfriends and her they email each other rather than call. And I thought that was quite an interesting little comment on the way things are at the moment for a lot of young people.
Yeah, definitely. I know a lot of people actually who are uncomfortable with speaking on the phone. I think that immediacy is intimidating perhaps for them
Mm,
because we often don't know what to say or like
yeah.
how to react properly.
And
And so
once said, you can't take it back, whereas you can
exactly,
delete a million times on a.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the reason why some people email, like I email a lot of friends and my emails go on for like pages and pages, is because I want to I want to come across as someone very considered and
Mm-hmm.
particular and proper.
Mm-hmm. So you're doing a bit of editing of yourself in that, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
No, totally human thing to do, I think. There is a question that I wanted to talk about in relation again to this whole idea, and I'm speaking about heterosexual women when I say this, but
Mm.
it's probably something that's crossed many heterosexual women's mind at some point, and that's that without someone else, they are nothing. And at one point, Jenna says, without Mark, am I missing some essential fact of womanhood? Alone, I am an anomaly, a thing to be laughed at, a thing to be pitied. And just that crushing sense of that she just really doesn't feel validated unless someone else wants her.
Yeah.
Yeah, just obviously it speaks to the whole narrative in the book, but this idea that she's so worried about being alone that she might, like you say, go down a harmful path rather than be alone is quite profound, really.
I honestly still believe that um, the society operates in a way where a woman's idea of her sense of importance and value comes from inciting desirability in the man. And if you're not desired, you don't feel like there's something like you feel like there's something missing about your importance and your place in this world. And like I've definitely felt that throughout my 20s, and it's such an awful feeling, and it's so hard to talk yourself out of that because you and I, we live in this world. We can't just decide one day to wake up and not like to change how other people see us.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Absolutely it is. Now, I did read a book. I did read a comment that you had said that you'll probably never read a straight white man's work again. So I wondered, who are you reading at the moment, and who's your inspiration, and who are you drawing on in the writing world?
Most of my reading actually comes from nonfiction writers, like essayists. So I've been reading a lot of Deborah Levy, I'd say is one of my favorite writers, and Rebecca Solnit. I've been reading translations from Korean literature in the last few years. That's been quite, like, translations in English have become much more popular. So that's been really encouraging. And I've also started Eric Savini's a book called The Deviant's War, which is, Eric Savini is a gay historian he went to Harvard, but the book that he wrote is nonfiction, and it traces the story of Frank Kamini, who was a astronomer for the US government in the 50s, but he was gay. And I'm learning so much about gay history in the States and the ways in which homosexuality was so just like extraordinarily violently legislated against. It was a crime, and a lot of gay men had to find solace in public bathrooms, and Frank Kamini was fired from his job for being a homosexual. And so I'm just trying to read history just outside of the lens of the traditional canon, because I feel like so much of that is just not in the mainstream, and I want to kind of decolonialize my mind.
So is that leading you to a new writing project at all?
I'm working on my second novel, so that's really exciting.
And can you release any details of it yet, or is it all top secret?
Vaguely, I suppose. I can say that it's about a group of classical musicians. I think I have an obsession with classical musicians. I don't know why yet, but I think I'm working through that. And it's about a female's sort of, it's also from a female Asian's perspective, and about how it's about a young woman who becomes deformed by a love that she has for another man. yeah, so
That sounds really interesting. I look forward to it. I think we'll leave it there because we're getting close to time. So yeah, it was really great conversation. Thank you so much for all your answers and for the book.
Oh, thank you so much. It was lovely to
Thanks.
chat to you.